The storm came through on a Tuesday night in late September, and by Wednesday morning our barn was nothing but broken timber and twisted metal scattered across the east pasture like God's own tantrum. I stood there in my bare feet, dew soaking through my wool socks, watching Dad survey the wreckage with the kind of quiet that meant we were in for a long winter if we didn't act fast. "Samuel," he said, not looking at me, just staring at what used to be the place where we kept our livestock, our hay, our livelihood. "Go tell your mother we'll need to send word to Bishop Miller. We're going to need help." I nodded and turned back toward the house, but I kept looking over my shoulder at the destruction. 40 years that barn had stood. Dad built it with his own father when he was barely older than I am now. And one night of wind and rain had reduced it to kindling. 3 days later, Bishop Miller sent word back. Help was coming. A man from the Kishakoquillas Valley district, known for his skill with timber framing, he'd arrive Monday at first light and stay until the work was done. "What's his name?" I asked Dad as we prepared the guest room above the kitchen. "Jonas Byler," Dad said, smoothing the quilt Mom had laid across the narrow bed. "Good family. His grandfather knew mine, back in Lancaster County." I tried the name out in my head. Jonas. It felt solid, like something you could build on. Monday morning I was up before the rooster, standing by the kitchen window with a cup of coffee, watching the lane for any sign of movement. The mist hung low over the fields and everything was gray and hushed, like the world was holding its breath. I saw the wagon first, a dark shape emerging from the fog, pulled by 2 bay horses, moving at an easy pace. As it got closer, I could make out the driver. Broad shoulders, dark hair under a black hat, face I couldn't see clearly yet, but something about the way he held himself, straight and still, made my chest tighten with a feeling I couldn't name. The wagon turned into our drive, wheels crunching on the gravel. I should have gone outside then, should have called for Dad, should have done something useful. Instead, I stood frozen at that window, watching as Jonas Baylor pulled his horses to a stop beside what was left of our barn. He sat there for a moment, just looking. His eyes moved slowly across the debris, then up to the farmhouse, taking in the whole spread of our land, like he was reading a story written in fence posts and furrows. And then, I don't know what made him do it, he looked straight at the kitchen window, straight at me. Even through the glass and the morning mist, I felt the weight of his gaze. Dark eyes, serious face, something in his expression that seemed to see right through the window, through the walls, through me. My hand tightened on the coffee cup until I thought it might crack. He looked away first, climbing down from the wagon with the easy grace of a man who'd done it 1,000 times. But my heart was still hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. "Samuel," Dad's voice from behind me made me jump. "What are you doing standing there? Come help me welcome our guest." I set down the coffee cup and followed Dad outside, trying to ignore the way my palms had gone damp. Jonas Byler was taller than I'd expected, maybe 6 feet, with the kind of build that came from years of hard work. Not bulky, but solid, like he was carved from the same oak he worked with. His clothes were simple: black wool pants, blue shirt, suspenders, standard. Nothing that should have made me notice the way the fabric stretched across his shoulders when he reached into the wagon bed for his tools. "Jonas," Dad said, extending his hand, "I'm Abraham Yoder. This is my son Samuel." Jonas shook Dad's hand first, then turned to me. His grip was firm, calloused, warm. "Samuel," he said, and that was it. Just my name, but the way he said it made something flutter in my stomach like a bird trapped in a barn. Thank you for coming, I managed to say. We're grateful for the help. He nodded once, already looking past me toward the destruction. I'll need to see what lumber can be salvaged. Then we can talk about what needs to be ordered. His voice was quiet, controlled, not unfriendly, but careful, like every word cost him something. I found myself wanting to hear more of it. Samuel can show you around, Dad said. I need to check on the livestock in the temporary shelter. And just like that, I was alone with Jonas Byler standing in the wreckage of our old life, surrounded by broken wood and the smell of rain-soaked earth. He moved through the debris methodically, testing beams for soundness, sorting the salvageable from the ruined. I followed, ostensibly to help, but mostly just watching the way he worked. No wasted motion. Every action deliberate and sure. This can be reused, he said, running his hand along a support beam that had somehow survived the storm intact. Good Pennsylvania oak. Your father built well. He'll be glad to hear that, I said. He's been worried we'd have to start from scratch. Jonas straightened, looking at me directly for the first time since we'd shaken hands. Nothing's ever truly from scratch, he said. There's always something to build on. I wasn't sure if he was talking about the barn anymore. We worked together for the rest of that first week and I learned the rhythm of Jonas Byler. He was up before dawn, dressed and ready while the rest of us were still rubbing sleep from our eyes. He ate breakfast silently, methodically, like fuel rather than pleasure. And then he worked, steady, focused, unrelenting, until the sun went down. He didn't talk much, but he was a good teacher. When I struggled with a proper way to mortise a tendon joint, he showed me once, his hands guiding mine on the chisel, his voice low in my ear. Feel the grain. Let the wood tell you where it wants to be cut. I felt the grain. I also felt the heat of his body behind mine, the solid presence of him, the way his breath stirred the hair at the nape of my neck. My hands shook so badly I nearly ruined the joint. Steady, he said, and somehow I was. By the end of the second week, we had the foundation poured and the frame taking shape. Jonas worked without a shirt on the hot days, and I tried not to stare at the play of muscles across his back, the way sweat traced lines down his spine. I tried not to notice how his hair curled at the base of his skull, darkened with moisture. I tried not to think about what it would feel like to Samuel. His voice cut through my wandering thoughts. Hand me that square. I grabbed the tool from the ground beside me and passed it to him. Our fingers brushed as he took it, just skin against skin for half a second, but the contact sent electricity up my arm like I'd been struck by lightning. Jonas paused, square halfway to the beam he was measuring. His eyes found mine, and for a moment something passed between us. Recognition maybe, or acknowledgement. I don't know what to call it, but it was there, real as the wood and nails around us. Then he looked away, back to his work, and the moment was gone. But my hand still tingled where he touched it. That night at supper, Mom set an extra place at the table as she had every night since Jonas arrived. He took his usual seat across from me, head bowed for grace, eating steadily and efficiently while Dad talked about the weather and the corn harvest and plans for the following day. Jonas contributed little to the conversation, just nods and occasional yes sir responses when directly addressed. But I caught him looking at me sometimes, quick glances across the table that he'd immediately redirect to his plate when he realized I'd noticed. Under the table, our legs were almost touching. The kitchen table wasn't large, and Jonas was tall. If either of us shifted just slightly, our knees would bump. The possibility hung there between us, tension I could feel in the way he held himself carefully in his chair, the way I kept my own legs rigid to avoid accidental contact. And then it happened. Jonas reached for the butter dish at the same moment I moved to pass the bread, and his knee knocked against mine under the table. Solid warm pressure through layers of wool and cotton. Neither of us pulled away immediately. For maybe 3 heartbeats we sat there, connected by that simple contact, and I felt like the world had shifted on its axis. When we finally did move apart, it was slow, deliberate, not like we were avoiding something, but like we were reluctant to lose it. "More potatoes, Jonas?" Mom asked, apparently oblivious to the small earthquake that had just happened under her dining table. "No, thank you, Mrs. Yoder," he said, voice perfectly steady. "I'm full." But his eyes met mine across the table, and I saw something there that looked like hunger. The 3rd week brought cooler weather and longer days as we rushed to get the walls up before the worst of autumn set in. Jonas worked like a man possessed, and I matched his pace as best I could, even when my muscles screamed and my hands cracked and bled from the constant grip on tools and timber. We fell into a routine of shared silence, communicating mostly through gesture and glance. He'd nod toward a beam that needed moving, and I'd be there to help lift it. I'd hold a board in place, and he'd appear with nails and hammer working around me, like we'd been partners for years instead of weeks. There was something intimate about it, this wordless cooperation, like we were speaking a language only we understood. One evening just after sunset, I was walking back from the temporary sheep pen when I saw him by the well. He'd stripped down to wash, shirt hanging on the well crank, suspenders dangling loose around his waist. Steam rose from his skin where the cold water hit the heat of his body, and in the dying light, he looked like something from a painting. All clean lines and honest muscle, head tilted back as he splashed water over his face and neck. I should have looked away, should have given him privacy. But I stood there, frozen again, watching drops of water trace paths down his chest, over his ribs, disappearing into the waistband of his pants. His skin was pale where his shirt usually covered, dark from sun elsewhere, and I found myself wondering what it would feel like under my hands. He must have sensed my presence because he straightened suddenly, water dripping from his hair, and looked directly at me, caught, staring, like some kind of voyeur. I spun around so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet, hurrying toward the house with my face burning with shame and something else I didn't want to name. Behind me, I heard the soft sound of him putting his shirt back on, but I didn't turn around again. That night at dinner, I could barely look at him. Every time I did, I saw him as he'd been by the well, clean and strong and beautiful in a way that made my chest ache. He seemed unchanged, eating his meal with the same quiet focus as always. But once I caught him watching me with an expression I couldn't read. After dinner, I escaped to my room early, claiming tiredness. But I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, trying not to think about Jonas Byler's bare skin gleaming in the twilight. The barn was nearly finished now. Another week, maybe 2, and Jonas would pack his tools back into his wagon and return to Kishakokia's valley. The thought sat in my stomach like a stone. I'd never felt this way about anyone before. Had never thought about other men the way I found myself thinking about Jonas. Growing up Amish, you learn early that such thoughts are dangerous, forbidden. You learn to push them down, bury them deep, pretend they don't exist. But Jonas made that impossible. Every day working beside him, breathing the same air, sharing the same space, made it harder to deny what was happening inside me. The way my pulse quickened when he spoke my name, the way I found excuses to stand close to him, to breathe in the scent of sawdust and honest sweat that clung to his clothes. The way I lay awake at night, imagining conversations we'd never have, touches that would never happen. It was wrong. I knew it was wrong, but knowing didn't make it stop. One night, unable to sleep again, I slipped out of the house and walked toward the construction site. The barn's frame stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, looking like the skeleton of some great beast. Almost there, almost finished, almost time for Jonas to leave. I was surprised to find I wasn't alone. Jonas stood inside the frame, arms crossed, looking up at the rafters we'd raised just that afternoon. He'd heard me coming. He must have, but he didn't turn around. "Can't sleep either?" I asked softly, stepping into the space that would soon be our new barn. "Too quiet," he said. "I'm used to the sound of rain on a finished roof." We stood there together in comfortable silence, surrounded by the smell of fresh-cut lumber and the distant sound of night birds calling to each other across the fields. Above us, the Milky Way stretched from horizon to horizon, more brilliant than I had ever seen it. "You do good work," I said eventually. "So do you. I had a good teacher." He turned then, looking at me in the dim starlight. "You would have figured it out on your own. You have good hands for this kind of work." The compliment warmed me more than it should have. My grandfather was a carpenter. Dad says I get it from him. Maybe. Jonas was quiet for a moment, then added, "But skill isn't something you inherit. It's something you choose to develop." "Is that what you chose? Carpentry?" A shadow crossed his face. "It chose me more like after." He stopped, shook his head. "It doesn't matter." But I found myself wanting to know, wanting to understand what had shaped this quiet, serious man who'd walked into our lives and turned everything upside down without even trying. "You ever build something and not want to leave it behind?" I asked softly. Jonas was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. Then, "All the time." He turned to leave, boots crunching on the wood, shavings scattered across the ground. But after a few steps he paused, looked back over his shoulder. "You should get some rest," he said. But his voice was gentler now, softer, like the words meant more than they said. Then he walked into the darkness, leaving me alone under the stars, surrounded by the bones of the barn we'd built together, wondering what would happen when there was nothing left to build. Part 2. The next morning brought the kind of autumn rain that Pennsylvania knows how to do, steady, insistent, turning the world gray and soft around the edges. Jonas and I stood in the doorway of what would soon be the barn's main entrance, watching water cascade from the gutters Dad and I had installed just the day before. "Good test," Jonas said, nodding toward the gutters. "They're holding." I wanted to tell him that of course they were holding. He taught me how to hang them properly, had watched me measure twice and cut once, had guided my hands when I struggled with the brackets. But the words felt too heavy with meaning, so I just nodded. "Storm should pass by afternoon," he continued, checking the sky through the gray curtain of rain. "We can finish the loft boards then." The loft boards. The last major piece of construction. After that, there would be only small tasks, hanging doors, final adjustments, cleanup, maybe 3 days of work, 4 at most. And then Jonas Baylor would thunder pack his tools and return to whatever life waited for him in Kishakoquia's valley. The thought made my chest tighten like someone was pulling a rope around my ribs. We settled in to wait out the storm, sitting on upturned buckets near what would be the center of the barn floor. The rain drummed against the metal roofing, and occasional drops found their way through gaps in the boards, creating small pools on the plywood subfloor. The air smelled of wet wood and earth and something else, something clean and sharp that might have been ozone or might have been the scent of Jonas's soap. We sat across from each other, maybe 4 feet apart, close enough that if either of us stretched our legs, our boots would touch. Close enough that I could see the way the dim light caught in his dark hair, the faint lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into the sun. "You have more storms like this?" he asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "October's usually wet," I said. "Dad says we're lucky we got the roof on when we did." Jonas nodded, looking up at the rafters we'd raised together, the boards we'd nailed with our own hands. "It's good work," he said quietly. "It'll last." There was something in his tone that made me look at him more closely. A weight, maybe, or sadness, like he was talking about more than just lumber and nails. "How long have you been doing this?" I asked. "Building, I mean." 12 years, he said. "Since I was 17. Same age I am now." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "I learned from my uncle. He had a crew that traveled between districts helping with the barn raisings, house construction. I went with them one summer." "And," he shrugged, "never went back to farming?" "What about your family's farm?" Something shifted in his expression, a door closing. "My brother took it over. He was always better suited to that life anyway." I wanted to ask what he meant, but the way he said it warned me off. Instead, I watched a drop of water work its way down one of the support beams, following the grain of the wood like it knew exactly where it belonged. "Do you miss it?" I asked eventually. "Having your own place, I mean, instead of traveling." Jonas was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Sometimes. But there's something to be said for building things that outlast you, knowing that long after you're gone, families will gather in spaces you helped create." The rain was softening now, the heavy drumming becoming a gentler patter, but neither of us moved to resume work. We sat there in the growing quiet, and I found myself studying the lines of his profile, the way his hands rested loose and easy on his knees, the careful way he held himself even when we were alone. "Samuel," he said suddenly, and my name in his quiet voice made something flutter in my chest. "Yes?" But he just shook his head, looking down at his hands. "Nothing. Just, this is good work we've done together." "It is," I agreed, though I suspected we were both talking about more than carpentry. The rain stopped completely just after noon, and we spent the afternoon installing the final loft boards, long planks of pine that would provide storage space for hay and equipment. It was delicate work, requiring one person to balance on the narrow beams while the other fed boards up from below. I volunteered to work up top, partly because I was younger and more agile, but mostly because it gave me an excuse to be close to Jonas when he handed up each board. Our fingers would brush with each exchange, brief contacts that I found myself anticipating like small gifts. I was working my way across the last beam, arms full of board, when my foot slipped on a patch of moisture left by the morning's rain. For a heart-stopping moment, I felt myself pitching forward, saw the barn floor rushing up to meet me 12 feet below. Then Jonas was there, somehow, his arms around my waist, pulling me back against the solid warmth of his chest. We stood frozen like that for several heartbeats, me pressed against him, his arms tight around me, both of us breathing hard from the shock and sudden closeness. Careful, he murmured, his voice rough in my ear. I could feel the rise and fall of his chest against my back, the strength in the arms that held me steady, could smell the scent of him, wood shavings, and honest sweat, and something underneath that was purely Jonas. My head fit perfectly in the hollow between his shoulder and his neck, and for just a moment I let myself imagine what it would be like to turn in his arms, to "I'm okay," I managed to say, though my voice came out shaky. But Jonas didn't let go immediately. His arms stayed around me for several seconds longer than necessary, and when he finally released me, it was slowly, reluctantly. His hands lingered on my shoulders, steadying me, and when I turned to face him, I found his dark eyes searching my face with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Thank you," I whispered. He nodded once, but didn't step back. We stood there on the narrow beam, inches apart, and I could see my own reflection in his eyes, could see the slight tremor in his hands before he clenched them into fists at his sides. "We should finish this," he said finally, but his voice was hoarse. Yes, I agreed, though finishing was the last thing I wanted to do. 2 days later, Jonas announced that we needed more hardware. Hinges for the main doors, additional bolts for the sliding track. "I'll take the buggy into town," he said to Dad over breakfast. "Should be back by afternoon." "Take Samuel with you," Mom said, refilling Jonas's coffee cup. "He knows where Zimmerman's hardware is and you'll need help loading." I tried to keep my expression neutral, but my pulse quickened at the prospect of time alone with Jonas, away from the farm, away from watching eyes to dynast, and the constant presence of my family. The morning was crisp and clear, with the kind of blue sky that made everything look sharp-edged and new. Jonas handled the reins with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else, and our mare stepped along at an easy pace, her breath visible in small puffs in the cool air. We rode in comfortable silence for the first few miles, passing farms where other Amish families were finishing their harvest, bringing in the last of the corn and preparing for winter. But as the miles passed, I became increasingly aware of Jonas beside me on the bench seat, the solid weight of him, the way his hands moved with the reins, the careful distance he maintained between us even in the confined space of the buggy. "It's beautiful country," he said eventually, nodding toward a field where a dozen Holsteins grazed in morning sun. "You don't have country like this in Kishakokila's valley." "Different," he said. "More mountains. The valleys are narrower, hemmed in. This..." He gestured at the rolling hills around us. "This feels open, like you could see forever if you climbed high enough." I'd lived here all my life, but seeing it through his eyes made me notice things I'd taken for granted. The way the morning mist clung to the creek bottoms, the patchwork of harvested fields and green pastures, the red barns standing like exclamation points against the landscape. "Do you think you'll miss it?" I asked. "When you go back?" Jonas was quiet for so long I wondered if he'd heard me. Then, "There are things I never speak of, but it doesn't mean I don't feel them." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning I wasn't sure I understood. I wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to push for more, but something in his tone warned me that this was as much as he was willing to say. Instead, I watched his hands on the reins, strong hands, scarred from years of work, gentle with the horse's mouth. Hands that had guided mine when I was learning to cut mortise joints. Hands that had steadied me when I slipped, held me just a little too long. "Sometimes I think about leaving," I said quietly, surprising myself with the admission, "seeing what's beyond all this. And sometimes I think about staying somewhere long enough to see something I built grow old," Jonas replied, not looking at me. We rode the rest of the way to town in silence, but it was a different kind of quiet now, charged with things unsaid, heavy with the weight of admission and possibility. At Zimmerman's Hardware, we loaded our supplies efficiently and without much conversation, but I caught Jonas watching me as I hefted boxes into the buggy bed, and when our eyes met, neither of us looked away quickly this time. The ride home seemed shorter, though we took the same route at the same pace. Maybe it was the weight of the loaded buggy, or maybe it was the knowledge that each mile brought us closer to the end of our time together. Either way, I found myself wishing the mare would slow down, wishing the road would stretch longer, wishing we could drive like this forever, just the two of us, and the rhythm of hoofs on packed earth, and the comfortable presence of unspoken understanding. That evening, Jonas and I finished hanging the main barn doors, massive sliding panels that moved on a track system he'd engineered himself. It was satisfying work, seeing the final major piece fall into place, watching the barn transform from a building site into something that looked like it had always belonged on our land. But satisfaction was tempered by the knowledge that we were truly finished now. Tomorrow would bring only cleanup and final adjustments. By evening, Jonas would pack his tools. The day after that, he'd be gone. The thought sat in my stomach like a cold stone. After supper, I found myself restless, unable to settle to anything. I tried reading, tried helping Mom with the dishes, tried writing in the journal I kept for a recording farm business. Nothing held my attention. Finally, I gave up and stepped out onto the front porch, hoping the cool night air would quiet my racing thoughts. Jonas was already there, sitting on the porch steps looking out at the barn we'd built together. It stood solid and complete against the star-filled sky, a testament to weeks of shared labor and growing understanding. "Mind if I sit?" I asked. He shifted slightly to make room, and I settled beside him on the wooden step, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cool night air. Close enough that if either of us moved just slightly, our shoulders would touch. "Hard to believe it's finished," I said. "Good work takes time," Jonas replied, "but it's worth the wait." We sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds, crickets in the grass, the distant lowing of cattle, a barn owl calling from somewhere in the darkness. Above us, the Milky Way stretched from horizon to horizon, more brilliant than it ever seemed in summer. "I've been thinking," Jonas said suddenly, his voice quiet in the darkness. "About what?" "About what you said, about leaving, seeing what's beyond all this." I waited, not trusting myself to speak. "There's wisdom in staying," he continued, "in putting down roots, building something that lasts. But there's also," he paused, searching for words, "there's also something to be said for knowing when it's time to go. Is it time for you to go?" The question hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure either of us was brave enough to cross. Jonas was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was so soft I had to lean closer to hear. "Sometimes what we build stays with us longer than we're allowed to admit." I felt the weight of those words, the careful way he'd chosen them, like he was telling me something important without saying it directly. "What if," I started, then stopped, not sure how to finish the thought. "What if what?" "What if someone didn't want you to go?" Jonas turned to look at me, then really look at me, and in the starlight I could see something in his eyes that looked like pain and hope and regret all mixed together. That would make it harder, he said quietly, but not less necessary. Why? But he just shook his head, turning back to look at the barn. Some things aren't meant to be, Samuel, no matter how much we might want them. We sat in silence after that, side by side on the porch steps, watching the barn we'd built together stand solid against the night sky. I wanted to say more, wanted to ask him what he meant, wanted to tell him about the way my chest tightened when I thought about him leaving, but something in his stillness warned me that we'd already said more than we should have. Eventually, Jonas stood. I should get some rest. Early start tomorrow. Yes, I agreed, though I made no move to follow him inside. He paused at the porch door, looking back at me. Thank you, he said, for helping, for all of it. Thank you for coming, I replied, for staying as long as you did. He nodded once, then disappeared into the house, leaving me alone with the night and the weight of everything we hadn't said. Dawn came too soon, gray and quiet with a chill that spoke of winter's approach. I was up early as had become my habit over the past weeks and found Jonas already loading his tools into the wagon bed. He worked methodically, each piece of equipment placed with the same care he'd shown in using it. Dad appeared with a thermos of coffee and a package that I knew contained sandwiches Mom had prepared for Jonas's journey. They spoke quietly for a few minutes, words of thanks and safe travels and promises to send word if we ever needed help again. Then it was my turn. I approached the wagon slowly, carrying the wrapped loaf of bread Mom had pressed into my hands at the kitchen door. It was still warm from the oven, and I could smell the honey she drizzled over the top before baking. For the road, I said, holding it out to him. Jonas took the package, but instead of placing it in the wagon, he held it between us. Our fingers brushed as he adjusted his grip, and neither of us pulled away immediately. The contact was brief, barely a touch, but it sent warmth up my arm and straight to my chest. Safe travels, I managed to say. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw my own feelings reflected in his dark eyes, regret and longing and something that might have been love if we'd been different people living different lives. You too, he said quietly, in whatever you choose to build next. The words felt like a benediction, like a blessing and a goodbye all wrapped together. He climbed up onto the wagon seat, took up the reins, and gave a soft command to his horses. The wagon pulled away slowly, wheels crunching on the gravel drive. I stood there watching until it disappeared around the bend, until the sound of hoofs faded into the distance, until there was nothing left but the empty road and the barn we'd built together, standing solid and complete against the morning sky. I looked up at that barn, at the straight lines of the roof, the perfectly hung doors, the solid foundation that would keep it standing for decades to come. Jonas was right. Good work lasted. The question was whether the feelings we'd built alongside it would prove as enduring, or whether they'd fade with time and distance like morning mist in the sun. Only time would tell. But as I stood there in the growing light, I thought I could still feel the warmth of his touch on my fingers, still hear the gentle way he'd said my name, still sense the weight of all the words we'd never quite managed to say. Some things I realized didn't need to be spoken to be real. They lived in the spaces between words, in glances and touches, and moments of shared silence. They lived in the careful way we'd worked together, the trust we'd built plank by plank, the understanding that had grown between us like something planted in rich soil, and they lived in the barn itself, in every joint we'd cut together every beam we'd raised, every nail we'd driven with our own hands. Jonas Byler might be gone, but what we'd built together would remain, a testament to partnership and patience and something deeper that had no name. I touched the finished wood of the doorframe once more, then turned and walked back to the house where the rest of my life was waiting. Sam angst es die